As you know, tonight we've got Michael Collins, who's written a fascinating book on Windrush cricket, which I'd imagine a number of you have probably read, and he's going to run through a certain amount of that and talk about some of the context behind his research, and also it's got a very nice slide presentation to support it. And Michael is actually a member of the ACS, so we always like it when members come and talk to us. He also, as you know, was part of the committee of the ICC, which looked into equality in cricket a few years ago. And so he's very engaged with the sport. And we're really interested to hear what he's got to say tonight. So, Michael, may I hand it over to you, and welcome to the ACS. Thank you for coming along.
Peter, thank you so much, and a very big thanks to each of you for joining this evening. I really appreciate it. I am indeed a member of the ACS, and drew upon the expertise of the community a number of times during the research that went into this book, which was invaluable. And it's a wonderful group of people who I think are really sort of understanding and furthering the extent to which cricket shines a light on and is indeed integrated into a wider kind of spectrum of questions about history, society, culture, and dare I say it, even politics. I think that's probably to some people's chagrin, the fact that cricket is a heavily politicized game. But in some senses, the talk that I'm about to give is an effort to sort of persuade you, if you need persuading, that is in fact the case, and that cricket in its very origins and essence has always been the carrier of political messages and ideological content, however much we would like to keep it kind of pure and pristine. So I'll begin really in the sort of, not quite the beginning, but the early phase. Not particularly this painting as such, but rather a reflection on the extent to which cricket constituted an incredibly important space in terms of the social history of colonization. So this painting is from 1861, the Calcutta Cricket Club, or the Calcutta Sports and Cricket Club, on the Maidans of Calcutta, as it was then called, recently renamed Kolkata, as part of the nationalist and indigenization drive that's been led by the BJP government over there. But I'll call it Calcutta in this talk because that's what it was referred to historically. So the Calcutta Club was founded in 1792, making it only 5 years younger than our venerable and esteemed Marylebone Cricket Club in London. And the reason I mention that is at least twofold. I mean, firstly, to point out that white settlers, colonists, established sports clubs, indeed cut a square for the purposes of playing cricket, almost upon arrival in colonial contexts. It's literally one of the first things that people did to take care of sport and recreation. And I think that speaks to the integral nature of sport and play in human existence. And of course, in the British historical tradition, sport is very, very significant, perhaps more significant than in many other national histories. But this fact brings forth a number of things that we can reflect on. So firstly, we see that the Sports and Social Club, and particularly the Cricket Club, is a space where Europeans, as they were called, would gather. And by the way, there would be a wide spectrum of people from other backgrounds, not just English backgrounds, but also, of course, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish, who were very keen to imbibe and perform a game which was the dominant game of empire, indeed the imperial game. So social spaces in which Europeans would gather to, establish a form of social capital, to not simply play sport or cricket in this case, but also to exchange information, to experience conviviality and camaraderie, to protect themselves, it has to be said, from what was seen as a hostile native environment, with all of the kind of racialized hostility that went with the process of colonial settlement during that period in time. So in other words, the point I'm making here is that the sports club is something that social and cultural historians ought to take seriously. And as it happens, I don't want to dwell too much on the academic literature, but as it happens, in a lot of mainstream history writing about empire, sport is not actually treated that seriously. And I think that's quite a significant problem. Of course, we can think of works like Richard Holt's Sport and the British, or J.A. Mangan's work on Victorian public schools and imperial culture. These are incredibly important works. But what's quite interesting from an academic history perspective is the extent to which they have been marginalized through what I would call intellectual snobbery, the sense that sport isn't the subject of proper history. And much of what I'm trying to do with this book is to argue with my colleagues that actually sport, and particularly cricket, cannot be ignored in the context of imperial history. In this painting by Percy Carpenter, there are many notable features. You see Government House in the background there. And although we can't quite make out the figures, what we're watching here is a game between the Calcutta Club and the Rangoon Regiment, which was visiting Calcutta at the time. But the really significant thing about this, which is both blindingly obvious and therefore easily overlooked, is the public nature of cricket. You can't play cricket in private, or not very easily. You have to be fantastically wealthy to do so. But much cricket, and this goes for the present age as well as the post-war period that I've written about a lot, and the Victorian age, and especially the colonial context, is public and performative. It's a sport upon which the native, quote unquote, is able to gaze and observe. And in that sense, the performance of cricket, and here I'm thinking beyond the club, as it were, beyond the social space, the performance of cricket becomes a really significant way in which ideas of Englishness, and particularly English masculinity and the codes of the game, are demonstrated to native populations in colonial contexts. And that has a number of sort of significant factors and elements to it, which we can comment upon. The first is to think about the fact that obviously observance leads to mimicry. Mimicry in all colonial contexts has led to the development of mastery, and ultimately over the years the superseding of the colonial relationship. In other words, all colonized territories that have picked up the game of cricket have at some point or other over time mastered it, perfected it, some would say, and of course vanquished England at the game. And that has a very significant political dimension, because if, and I would argue that this is the case, if cricket and Englishness are kind of coterminous in terms of the projection of imperial power from the late 18th century onwards, then the demise of the England cricket team over the long term, and particularly I think this is quite acute in the 1980s and 1990s, is a source of collective psychological trauma, whether we see that at the conscious level or the subconscious level, and I'll come back to that. But across the empire, what we see over time is the establishment of cricket clubs very, very early on. We can think of maybe Barbados, 1805, and a whole nexus of cricket and sports clubs, which are constituted in far-flung corners of the British Empire, across Australia, in Southern Africa, throughout the Caribbean, and of course in India and out in New Zealand. So in other words, the cricket club becomes a very significant node or space in which empire is both socially constituted and symbolically performed for a native audience. That's a sociological argument, but in a different way, in a sort of more cultural and symbolic form, cricket historically has also been a way in which the idea of the native population is communicated and circulated through the empire. So this postcard happens to date from 1912. And it's a postcard which I actually picked up in Melbourne, and that's significant in the sense that it depicts a game being played in Barbados, informally, of course, but it's a piece of material culture, a non-textual source for a historian, which is being circulated and sent across the British Empire to its far-flung corners. And in a sense, I mean, there are multiple interpretations of this postcard, but I would suggest that in a way, the postcard depicts a very kind of pleasant image to particularly the British metropolitan gaze upon its colonial context. What's happening here is that the imperial game is being picked up, enjoyed, but clearly not perfected or mastered. There's a sense in which, if you look at the field positionings, there are lots of people gathered there at short mid-wicket. It's all quite unorthodox. And I think this is a kind of pleasing image circa 1912. The idea essentially, very heavy inverted commas here, of the sort of jolly native playing the great game, but not in a threatening or menacing way. And this kind of imagery, as well as imagery of extremely successful cricketers from colonial contexts, is distributed across what I would call the imperial public sphere, from the 19th century onwards, but particularly into the early 20th century. We're thinking about postcards, we're thinking about the pages of Wisden, later on the Cricketer magazine, boys' comics. This is largely a boys' thing, of course, at this historical juncture. Cigarette cards, and the like. A whole kind of plethora of elements of material culture that depict cricket and imperial community, a community across the globe of cricket-loving peoples. And the West Indies, as it was then referred to, of course, is a key part of that community. And that is quite significant, because what that does, despite the heavily racialized social structures that we were dealing with in this period, let's say the 1910s, 1920s and onwards, nonetheless, the West Indian occupies an elevated space within that imperial social structure, precisely because of the adoption of the game of cricket and the increasing excellence that is displayed in that particular part of the world. And that idea of an imperial public sphere grows and takes on an added dimension in the winter of 1932 and into 1933, with the advent of BBC Empire Radio, in which cricket broadcasting features from the very beginning, and prominently so. And what that allows us to do, if we imagine us sitting here in metropolitan Britain in 1933, listening to the radio, it allows us to kind of imagine ourselves as being part of an imperial space, corners of the globe to which we may never go, probably never visit. And yet the sounds, the descriptions of those spaces become very intimate and immediate through radio broadcasting. So these are some of the ways in which cricket features in terms of the intersection of sport and imperial community. What we see in terms of sort of racial stereotypes evolving over time is a sort of ambivalence about the idea of the West Indian in particular as, on the one hand, a physically threatening force, and on the other hand, an infantilized subject of representation. And if that sounds a little extreme, I think that it is recognizable, particularly in the writings of Neville Cardus in the 1920s, that the depiction of the West Indian cricketer as overly enthusiastic, incapable of establishing the kind of control and planning and strategizing over the game that's required to win test matches is a prominent theme. And that theme is then kind of embodied and encapsulated in 1950 in the idea of the Calypso cricketer. The Calypso cricketer is a theme which is constantly kind of deployed in rhetoric and writing across the 20th century or the later 20th century. It still comes up these days on Test Match Special, Calypso, the Calypso style, the Calypso cricketer, etc. I sometimes think Bazball actually was invented far before Brendan McCullum emerged on the scene, and it was partly a kind of Calypso style of cricket. But the point here, more sort of politically, as it were, is that the Calypso trope, the Calypso theme, was used and drew upon a long history of the depiction of West Indians as infantile, as childlike. It was used in the 1950s and 1960s both to praise but also to denigrate. And that's one of the kind of key themes here, is that in cricket rhetoric and language, what often looks like a kind of friendly bit of banter or a kind of form of praise, the calypso style, this, that, and the other, is actually a way to kind of undermine the authority and capacity of, in this case, we're talking about the West Indian. And as a point on that, a kind of concluding point on the calypso cricketer, Sir Clive Lloyd used the term with his team in order to motivate the team of the mid-70s onwards to perform in a ruthless and professional style in order to dominate world cricket for a very long period of time. In other words, they detested this term calypso. It meant that they were turning up to entertain, but not to win. They were there for a good time, but not to dominate cricket. So that kind of gives us an insight into how that terminology is seen from the other side of the divide, as it were. And of course, the demise of the term calypso really kind of, came in the mid-1970s when the calypso cricketer becomes the Dark Destroyer, the monstrous 7-foot fast bowler, as Wisdom Cricket Monthly put it in 1990, willing to break bones and smash faces. There is a huge outpouring through the 70s and 80s of commentary on West Indian cricket, which then depicts it as mechanical, boring, ruining the game, devilish, fanatical, you name it. The adjectives go on and on and on. But essentially, there you can see in the top right-hand corner the bruising on Brian Close from 76, Manchester, I think that is. Essentially then depicting the West Indian as having kind of broken free from the constraints of the colonial relationship to become a brutalizing and dominating force in world cricket. And that was something which I think was particularly traumatic for England as a cricket team, but also the commentariat and a wider section of society. Now, if cricket was a way in which ideas about natives or West Indians was communicated across the empire and between England and the West Indies, it has also, and this is a very different thread, been seen as a mode of resistance and emancipation for the West Indians, and anti-colonial resistance. And of course, the most famous and most eloquent sort of exponent of this idea is a very familiar person to you all, I'm sure, C.L.R. James, who wrote what I think is a very fine book on cricket, Beyond the Boundary, in 1963. But the idea of cricket as a kind of mode of resistance has a wider kind of context and has been picked up a lot in the historical literature over the last sort of 30 or 40 years, mostly taking a Jamesian lead, but building on that and adapting it in certain ways. And one historical artifact which is kind of some interest in this respect is the Barbados cricket buckle, which I think many of you may have come across before. There's a very fine article by Tom Holland in Wisdom 2021 on this theme, so that may have introduced the buckle to some of you. What you can see in the top right-hand corner is an original view of the buckle, which unmistakably depicts an enslaved man. We can see the shackle on his forward foot, and indeed also a chain around the man's neck. And although he is clean bowled, it has been said many times by historians of West Indies cricket that the very act of an enslaved person picking up a cricket bat is sort of contains within it the idea of resistance to both slavery, but also to British rule in the Caribbean, and the kind of seeds and the potential of the rise of the West Indies as a world force, not just in cricket, but also in a bigger sense, with cricket being perhaps the most prominent way in which the Caribbean enters a kind of global consciousness. You can see actually, interestingly, that on the Barbados $10 coin, which features there on the left of your screen, I think it's the left. I'm not sure how you're seeing it, whether it's the other way around. But anyway, the larger image there in the middle, that the shackle is actually removed, and this artifact could be a one-off. Some people say that it's actually been produced many, many times, but in a sense, that particular debate about the provenance of the buckle and how many of them there are isn't really the most important thing. The most important thing is the idea that, as expressed by C.L.R. James, who's down there in the bottom right, looking at the buckle, that cricket is a mode of resistance and emancipation, but also, importantly, of upward mobility in the West Indies. So any of you who've studied Caribbean cricket history will know that classism and what's often referred to as colorism is an incredibly prominent part of the history of Caribbean cricket. In other words, there are very many stratifications within Caribbean islands in terms of which school you went to, which club you can play in, and color of skin and admission to clubs. And that's quite an important factor. But in Beyond a Boundary, James recounts a story which in some senses seems quite purely anecdotal and incidental, but I think is actually quite significant in terms of our understanding of the significance and meaning of cricket in the Caribbean historically. It's I think chapter 2 of Beyond a Boundary, where he's referring to his childhood home in Trinidad, in Tunapuna, where his house is positioned behind the wicket. He can overlook the game from his bedroom window behind the bowler's arm. And then he talks about a chap called Matthew Bondman, who is basically a kind of ne'er-do-well in the neighborhood, a chap that he describes quite gruesomely and grotesquely. He's a man who has no shoes, which of course is in that context, a sign of his poverty and social marginality. He's physically repulsive, according to James, and he's someone whom auntie and uncle would tell you to cross the street from if you were to see him coming the other way. So in all senses but one, Matthew Bondman is a down and out and a person and a reprobate. But then he concludes that paragraph by saying there was one thing about Matthew Bondman, and Matthew Bondman could bat. And that seemingly trivial aside tells you the extent to which James viewed cricket as an art form, an aesthetic practice, which he likened to le ballet or great art or theatre. And I think that idea of cricket in the Caribbean was shared among many generations and across classes, that cricket and excellence at cricket, and particularly the artistry of batting, could elevate you beyond your social situation and bring you great fame and riches and social progress. And that idea is echoed and illuminated in this short video, which I want to show you, which is narrated by the poet George Lamming, the Caribbean poet George Lamming. You can see him in the top right there. He's a black man from the Caribbean, but as was common for metropolitan intellectuals at that period of time in history, he spoke with a very impressive kind of clipped BBC accent. And here he's talking precisely about that idea of social elevation and representation for Caribbean cricketers.
This arena of spectators is the General Assembly of Connoisseurs in Waiting. Cricket is a religion founded by the English. West Indians are its most ardent apostles. What appears as a seasonal pastime here has a deeper meaning in the Caribbean. It has rewarded many a poor man with public acclaim at home. It allows him the role of ambassador abroad. Long after retirement, his reminiscences still preserve the fire of gospel. The cricket and the English language are twin pillars of a tradition which the West Indians share with their English opponents. And the game, like the language, has travelled far and taken root among different races. Its home consists of many mansions, but West Indians acknowledge England as the only headquarters. And they regard this event as the summit meeting of national heroes in a contest which is, for them, a daily recreation as well as a discipline and their national glory. The wish to win is natural, but a West Indian victory here would be on the scale of a palace revolution. And the emigrant who has made his home here may savor a certain sweetness of vengeance in an England defeat. Yet a player's skill, be he English or West Indian, will receive equal applause. Democracy is the order of the day.
Now, there are many things to be said about that video, and that's just 2 minutes of a much longer program which Lamming recorded for the BBC in 1963 called The West Indians. The program is not all about cricket, but it's noticeable and important that he chooses the Lord's Test of 63 to begin his exploration of the condition of the West Indian in Britain. And actually, I skipped too early, but the final scene where he says democracy is the order of the day shows a black West Indian sitting in between two white men in the crowd. And there is a sort of spirit of conviviality and as he says, democracy is the order of the day. But in actual fact, what Lamming is doing there is setting up a critique of the role of cricket in terms of what he regarded as the creation of a false, superficial layer of equality that existed at the international level for cricketers. And he takes the black man from the middle of the picture who's chatting merrily with two guys either side about the test match and follows him as he exits the ground and heads off into Paddington to try to find a room to rent. And I probably don't need to tell you how that goes. So what he's juxtaposing is the distinction between the cricketer, the idea of the cricketer and the idea of cricket and equality, and the reality of the black experience in terms of private citizenship. And that makes me return back a little bit earlier in time to Sir Leary Constantine. So this image is of Constantine up at Nelson in 1932. As many of you will know, Constantine was a celebrated, dramatically successful and very well-paid cricketer, working, playing in the Lancashire leagues throughout the 1930s. And his cricketing success enabled him to play a very, very prominent role in the war effort during the Second World War. He was probably the most famous West Indian in Britain during this period of time. And that created a lot of social connections for him. It enabled him to move in very high social circles and led to him playing a very, very prominent role during World War II. First and foremost, he was tasked with being the liaison officer for some 10,000 West Indians that came mostly to the northwest of England around Liverpool to work in factories and support the war effort. He also played a very prominent role on BBC in programs like West Indies Calling, pumping out propaganda for the war effort. I use that term neutrally and in a technical sense, not in a derogatory sense, but content which was being broadcast to the West Indies and across the empire to talk about the efforts of colonial people, how people were behind the British, how people were supportive of the war, how there was a sense of community and camaraderie during the war period. This picture depicts the Dominions versus England fixture, which took place over 2 days, starting on the 2nd of August, 1943. There are 3 black West Indians in this team. And by the way, I keep saying black West Indians, of course, because there are many white West Indians who are prominent in cricket during this period, which I'm sure most of you know. But there are 3 black West Indians in this team. There is no Dominion status for any Caribbean island at this point in time. But nonetheless, apropos my point earlier, the West Indies or West Indian cricketers are folded into this highest level community of imperial brotherhood. And the cricket that's being played here by Dominion's 11s and other teams like the British Empire 11, Sir Leary Constantine's 11, Pelham Warner's 11s that played at Lord's. A lot of the spirit and, if I can say so, kind of ideological content of this cricket is to demonstrate to British domestic audiences that the empire remains a living and breathing cultural community within which cricket is emblematic of that sense of togetherness. And of course, that was tremendously important for the prosecution of the war effort. With Britain isolated, the idea that Britain stood alone was actually not such a prominent theme during the war itself as some post-war historians have subsequently made it. What was almost ubiquitous was the idea that Britain and its empire stood in resistance to fascism and Nazi tyranny. Britain and its empire. And so these not, again, symbolic, non-textual forms of expressing that idea were tremendously important. The man in uniform is the Duke of Gloucester. He's shaking the hand of the Dominion's 11 captain, whose name escapes me just now, but in the middle you can see Bertie Clark, the leg spinner who played for the West Indian team that toured England in the summer of 1939, was indeed the man who bowled the last delivery of international cricket for 6 years. Down the line, you can see Leary Constantine peeking out, and then you can only see the nose, eyes, and forehead of Emmanuel Martindale, a fast bowler, also representing the West Indies in 39. Now, there's two things to say about this picture. The first is of course, the significance of cricket and empire for the war effort. But the other one, going back to Lamming's video, going back to this idea that there is a top level, I won't call it superficial because I think that's the wrong word. It's not superficial, it's incredibly meaningful and deep. But let's call it an elite level of cricketing camaraderie and community that exists versus the realities of racism and the black experience when any of these cricketers is only recognized as a private citizen. 3 or 4 days before Sir Leary Constantine turned out to represent King and Empire at Lord's on the 2nd of August, he had experienced the humiliating trauma of being ejected from the Imperial Hotel in Bloomsbury in central London on the 30th of July in front of his wife and children, simply for being a black man, a private citizen of colour. Of course, he was not recognised at that moment as the famous cricketer. He was not recognised as the loyal colonial who was supporting the war effort by being a liaison officer for the West Indian workers, and so on and so on. So I think it's a fascinating juxtaposition of two moments, the elite cricketer and the private citizen, within 3 to 4 days. Probably the most significant thing for me personally, interpreting all of this, is the fact that despite that humiliation and the indignation that he would have experienced and felt, he was still willing to turn out and to perform his duty in support of the war effort in this context. Now, this duality, as it were, reminds us or leads us into what is actually the substance of the book that I've written, which is the Windrush period. And the inheritance of the colonial ideological context is extremely profound, and in many ways is kind of replicated by Windrush patterns of settlement. And to explain and just probe a little deeper into that, what we see here, as you can read at the bottom in the text box, is the Mrs. Peake-Freen's Biscuit Company First 11, Bermondsey, South East London. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the Peake-Freen's company, but it was a very large biscuit factory known actually as Biscuit Town, such was its size. And there are a number of points to make about this. The first one is that easily overlooked, but I think very, very important, that when Windrush immigrants arrived from the Caribbean with this deep attachment to the game of cricket that C.L.R. James talks about so eloquently. They arrived in a country which was also absolutely imbued with a love of the game, a country, that is England, which was completely cricket mad. The wonderful historian David Kynaston, who often writes about cricket or builds cricket into his writings about post-war Britain, says that 1953, the Ashes victory of 1953, was probably the high point of cricket enthusiasm in England. He talks evocatively, or writes evocatively, about mothers with prams gathered around shop windows that have this newfangled device, the television showing in there, in the windows, or people hanging on the transistor radio, ball by ball commentary, that kind of thing. So it's very significant that cricket is really central zone of contact between the Black West Indian immigrant and the white native population in the late 40s and the early 1950s. Not to be overlooked, but something which I think is largely ignored by what I'm referring to here as mainstream historians of Britain, and particularly post-war Britain. And here the periodization, the change over time, is really, really granular. It's very narrow, and things are shifting year by year, if not 6 months by 6 months. The oral history work that I did, the interviews that I conducted with immigrants from the time or their children, and also the oral histories that I recovered from places like Transport for London Archives and so on, show that in the early 50s, and I think, okay, we're into 1955 here, but nonetheless, perhaps this fits into the same framework. In the early 1950s, particularly after the famous victory at Lord's in June of that year, of 1950, there was a real cachet to being a Black West Indian immigrant cricketer. Some people wrote and spoke about the kind of proprietorial attitude that works teams, captains might have. Literally sort of, you arrive on the job on a Monday. Oh, you're from Barbados, right? Well, you're playing cricket on Saturday. The assumption that you must be good at the game. And actually, a lot of the a lot of those that wrote about their experiences would say, yes, I was damn good. The standard of cricket in the Caribbean at that point in time was exceptionally high, partly because of the pervasiveness of its cohort, its playing cohort. But within a very short space of time, the reception of individual Black men into these works teams, and here my point is that the works team is ubiquitous. The pub team, the village team, cricket is everywhere in England in the early 1950s. It doesn't matter whether you're good or bad at the game. It is literally just what we do. It is our culture. It is, it is a religion. It is a form of cultural practice which is unquestioned. And that's a really significant fact. So a lot of individual Black immigrants are welcomed into teams, but for a very short period of time. Once the numbers increase, and as a matter of fact, the numbers of Windrush immigrants only start to peak by around the mid-1950s. The Windrush terminology is a little misleading in this respect. So, for example, we think of Windrush as a ship that arrived in 1948, and that is true. But the number of people arriving in 48, 49, and 50 is very, very small. So if we think more about the Windrush generation, those numbers start to move up to around 10,000 a year by the mid-1950s. And by the end of the 1950s, around 1960, the population of West Indians who've immigrated into Britain is over 200,000. The numbers are quite difficult to pin down, but is sizable and growing. And as the population grows, and as what I would call the latent racism within British society emerges into the foreground, particularly and spectacularly and brutally with the Notting Hill riots of 58, and then the murder of Kelso Cochrane, also in Notting Hill in 59, we start to see Black players increasingly rejected from white teams. And of course, there's a very banal element to this as well, which is just that a lot of the people coming in were, as I said, damn good. And none of us want to be out of the side. Playing cricket it's a sport, but it's a social activity. It's what many of us would live and breathe for every weekend. So the idea of being replaced in the team by an immigrant cricketer is, of course, not welcome for lots of people. So what we see then is the development of this incredible ecosystem across urban England of the Caribbean Cricket Club. And I'll just sort of give you a moment really to look at the list and the chronology. I'm hoping that you can see, I'm moving that. So the Caribbean team in London, which dates from 45, is essentially a wartime hangover. Much of the wartime cricket that's played by West Indians is of the very elite variety. We're talking about people like Bertie Clark, who was a medical doctor, an international cricketer, and subsequently the captain of the BBC cricket team. Many of them were playing for teams like that, very sort of high society. We're talking about a very small group of people. So I would call the Leeds Caribbean team, which was founded in Chapeltown by returning RAF engineers in 48, the first kind of proper working class immigrant Caribbean cricket team. But then what you see is really kind of a rapid growth of all of these teams across urban England: Nottingham, Manchester, many in London, of course, Leicester, Birmingham, Bristol, into the early 1960s. And relative to the size of the population, this is a very large and significant social formation, which mirrors in many ways the colonial practice of settlement. In other words, what these clubs are doing in the face of everyday racism at entirely white dominated cricket clubs that are established many generations, or even in some cases hundreds of years under establishment, in the face of the racism that they experience in those white cricket clubs, which, by the way, mirrors the racism that people experienced in the Anglican Church, what they do is simply set up their own clubs in which they feel welcome, included, opportunities to play. And of course, they become very, very successful. And again, mirroring the colonial encounter, once a team is established, once a Holmwood Unity or a West Indian St Albans and so on is established and asks to play the leading white British teams of the time in a friendly or to enter the leagues, it's very difficult to resist. Why would you not want to play a game of cricket against another team? And so the logic of the colonial encounter also unfolds in the 1960s post-colonial context in England. Many of these teams were phenomenally successful, and most successful teams of all actually are not listed here, and they were typically the transport teams, bus garages, train terminus kind of teams which are assembled, containing players who are playing national level fringes of the West Indies kind of standard cricket in the Caribbean before they migrate across to England. But really, the substance of my argument in the book, which is, of course, fundamentally about the game of cricket, but it's also a kind of contribution to, British history more generally. The argument that I'm making, put very simply and in a nutshell, is that cricket, alongside the church, although that is another book and it's not something I can cover in this particular book, the cricket and the church, but in this case, we're talking about the cricket club, is not just a kind of sporting or cultural pastime or an incidental aspect of the Black Caribbean experience in England. It is the absolute founding cornerstone of settlement. Cricket is what enabled Black people to put down roots and build community in England. Without cricket and without the cricket club, many immigrants, reflecting the almost universal immigrant experience, whether that's in the contemporary period, somebody heading off to Europe for a period of time, or someone heading off to the United States, any color or creed, most immigrants often say, I'm going somewhere for a short period of time to make some money, explore, and then of course I'll go back home. But of course, it rarely works out that way because mostly people put down roots. Often fundamental factor of the immigrant experiences. They meet people overseas. They meet people in the context of immigration. They have relationships. They have children. But the cricket club is how West Indians stayed. It is how West Indians remained in England. It is what they drew upon for sustenance, for a sense of community, for exactly those things that Europeans did in colonial contexts. Sharing information, feeling a sense of protection and cultural community in a sea of otherness and difference around them. Just the colors are reversed, the context is reversed. Now, I mentioned children. What we see, of course, then in the context of the settlement processes and practices is that these young kids that I have put from a beautiful photograph by Shirley Baker on the front of the book. These kids who are born to immigrant parents or have come over as young children grow up to also play the game, play in the club, and some of them become phenomenally successful and are very, very gifted cricketers. And the gentleman on the right-hand side of the picture there needs no introduction, Devon Malcolm. Devon Malcolm came over as a young boy from Jamaica, but was nurtured, and his cricket was developed by the Sheffield Caribbean's Cricket Club, which is listed on the previous slide. And of course, there are many, many individuals who fit this bill. So in other words, what we're seeing here is the development of an English Caribbean cricket ecosystem, which inevitably produces players of a very high caliber for whom the only pathway to elite cricketing success is England or the English county system. Now, of course, famously or infamously, Devon, who arrived in Yorkshire as a young boy, I can't remember exactly how old he was, possibly around 13, was unable to play for Yorkshire because at that time you had to be born within the county boundaries to represent the club, the county club. So he had to head off to Derbyshire to develop his cricketing career. But the point is, as with, say, David Lawrence at Bristol West Indians and others, there are many elite cricketers who are now occupying an in-between space. They are drawing on a West Indian cricket heritage and a Caribbean cricket community network in England for their sustenance and for their cricket development, their cricket pathway in contemporary language. But the only means of progress really into elite cricket is through the English county system and then to represent England. And of course, this throws up a lot of confusion and contradictions on all sides. This, of course, is Roland Butcher, who's the first black man to play for England. I'm not counting Basil d'Oliveira in that. I'm talking about black West Indians. And of course, Roland as well arrived from the West Indies, from Barbados, as a young boy. And I mention that because in terms of this kind of confusion, CLR James, who lived in the flat above the Brixton Advice Centre in the top right-hand slide there for around 10 years between 1980 and his death in 89, so around 9 or 10 years. I think struggled to really understand the difficulties and the kind of specificities and particularities of that black immigrant experience. He wrote about Butcher and spoke about Butcher in a lecture that he gave in London in 1981 about the West Indian immigrant experience and population. And he noted that Butcher had just made his debut for England and then joked to the assembled Caribbean crowd that he knew if anyone was going to do it, it had to be a Barbadian, because of course a lot of other people from the Caribbean sort of tease Barbadians for being the Little Englanders. You know, that Barbados is seen as a kind of Little England. But he sort of understood this to be a very natural course of events and seemed to think of it as entirely unproblematic. He said, well, this is James speaking in his writing. He said, well, Butcher's grown up here, he lives here, he has children here, he's married here. So it's completely natural that he would play for England. What else would he do? Now, in actual fact, that's completely wrong, because Roland Butcher in 1980 was hoping to play for the West Indies. He had a much more ambiguous position between those two teams. And I think it was Lawrence Rowe who was injured in the summer of 1980. And Roland Butcher, who was in his prime, absolutely kind of accustomed to playing on English wickets, was being very successful for Middlesex under Mike Brealey's captaincy, thought that he was in a prime position to step in and replace Lawrence Rowe. But they selected another cricketer, somebody Mohammed, whose full name escapes me, but I think was widely considered to be, inferior to Roland Butcher as a player. And this came as quite a shock to him. Anyway, the key point is that despite these photos of Roland, who became a great friend of Ian Botham and, was quite integrated within the team, he occupied that in-between position. He really could have gone either way. And this is something that James was not very clear on, because he saw cricket in that older anti-colonial context, that cricket was really about the rise of the West Indies, of a collective West Indies consciousness embodied by, the sublime and great, truly great cricketers of, from Constantine in particular onwards through the three Ws into Gary Sobers, and then, of course, Clive Lloyd, Viv Richards, Michael Holding, and so on. So this is an area of kind of complication which I've tried to bring out to explain just how difficult it is to be someone that inherits a West Indian or Caribbean cricket tradition, but is nonetheless struggling within state schools, county systems in England, where racism is really very, very commonplace and often extremely overt and aggressive. This article, in some ways, probably doesn't deserve as much attention as it gets, but nonetheless, it's somewhat indicative of the climate of racism in cricket in the mid-90s in England. This is the infamous "Is It in the Blood" article penned by a gentleman called Robert Henderson. I think more significantly was the fact that it was published, and it was seen as something which was not worthy is not the right word, but relevant and important to publish by the Wisden Cricket Monthly editor of the time, David Frith. But what this article says in a nutshell is black people cannot play for England because they are not truly English. In other words, it's a completely and fully racialized understanding of Englishness. Englishness is white, and no one who is of color can be English. So people like Devon Malcolm, Philip de Freitas, and others are just mercenaries. They're just playing the game, and they will never be able to perform properly. And in a sense, it was an explanation for England's failures on the pitch, because there were too many black people in the team. Now, Devon, of course, sued Wisden Cricket Monthly successfully for libel, and I'm told actually donated the money that I think he received to cricketing causes. But this was around the same time that Devon was sort of publicly humiliated, I think is the only way to say it, by having his bowling action remodeled publicly and then criticised by Ray Illingworth on the South Africa tour. There was an awful lot going on in English cricket in the mid-1990s, which I think expresses these multiple layers of trauma and anxiety about the presence of black people playing the game and representing England. What I think a lot of those people who are writing, and here I'm just going to conclude very quickly, a lot of people who are writing about cricket and expressing those views are not cognizant of the extent to which that black cricket ecosystem that I referred to earlier was operating along the ground, on the ground, underneath the surface. They were not cognizant of projects like the Haringey Cricket College. I have a photo there in the top left corner of Jenny Woztrak, who was actually Sir Frank Worrell's niece. An unusual name. I've never come across that name in any other context. Jenny Woztrak. She trained a lot of female cricketers at Haringey, and latterly was a mentor for Ebony Rainford Brent, who of course was the first black woman to go on and play cricket for England. People were not aware of these complexities, of the extent to which Caribbean cricket as manifested in England was contributing, in my view, so much to the strength, the richness, and the competitive nature of English cricket. They were not aware either, and here I have to skip backwards, of how cricket was constantly a form of political engagement. Here is a pamphlet from the 1972 charity match between a West Indian 11, known as actually the Brixton West Indians, and the police, which was replicated through the 1970s into bigger fixtures between Brixton West Indians and the Met police. So in other words, cricket was being constantly kind of utilized and invoked as a way of trying to build integration, of trying to kind of develop good race relations in the language of the time. All of this complexity that's going on at the societal level seems to be overlooked, not just by those who are writing articles like this in Wisden, but also by historians, by cricket commentators, by people like CLR, who are consistently focusing on the West Indian story, the elite cricket story. And it's that societal level, the everyday level, the way in which cricket and the cricket club is so fundamental to our sense of belonging, of community, something which I hope you can relate to, something which I think I've demonstrated was important in the colonial context, and something which was so important in 1950s England for both native English people and Black West Indian immigrants. That's the message of the Windrush cricket book. So thank you very much for listening, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions or hear any comments.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was extremely interesting, and I would hope that we've got a very eminent number of interested parties here who'd like to ask the first question or make some comments. Just far away.
Thank you, Michael, for a fascinating talk, and in particular, I think for the little clip you played, which I'd never seen before. Found it deeply affecting, not just because of the poetry of the language and the gorgeous cinematography. It looks a lot older, in fact, than it is or would otherwise look, because there are very few, if any, black faces at Lord's today. I wonder if you'd say a bit along the lines of that rather doleful reflection, indeed, about the obsolescence of cricket among England's Caribbean people more generally. As things are going, I don't think it's too dramatic to say that it seems unlikely to survive the Windrush generation itself. What accounts for this? Is the situation reparable?
Yes, thank you, Rodney. That's it's a very good question. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the very noticeable things about that that footage is how mixed the crowd is, and of course, because of the success of the West Indies team and the sort of iconic nature of the players, many West Indian immigrants would flock to the games to watch them, and that reached its peak in the 80s and the 90s. I'm sure that all of us can remember those games where games at the Oval that looked like sort of home fixtures for and sounded like home fixtures for the West Indies cricket team. In terms of what has happened, I mean, I think as so often with in history, when we're trying to explain change in history, there are many factors at work here which have kind of come together. I'll try to quickly summarize some of them. And there are a number of people who are responsible, as it were. On the one hand, I think that the racism and the exclusion that many Black people felt was palpable and tangible. So to put this in concrete terms, it was very difficult for a lot of Black West Indian teams in the 60s and 70s to enter domestic leagues. There was a lot of exclusion, and a lot of battles were fought for those teams to try and get recognition. But what was more difficult than that was to get resources. Now, of course, many of these teams were wandering sides. They didn't have, and this is a sort of political economy argument, they didn't have land, and they didn't have a pavilion, They didn't have the resources, the nets, etc., to kind of train the next generation. And it's for that reason that the history of Windrush cricket is difficult to write, because a pavilion, as any of you know who have got any connection to any established club, a pavilion is also a kind of archive. It has many, it's a repository of scorecards and photographs and artifacts from a club's history. But as a wandering team, it's very difficult to collect that kind of stuff. So the lack of resources was a big factor. But I will add that many of the people that I spoke to, the oral history work that I did for this project, were willing after some time to admit that they also had not planned carefully for the development of the next generation of cricketers. And that's so that sort of that responsibility, as it were, falls on the community. And there's another subtle dimension to this too, which came out in the oral testimonies of some of the younger players that I spoke to. There's one player I spoke to who was playing for one of the North London Caribbean teams in the early 80s as a young boy, very, very talented player. And he was clearly on the path to Middlesex in terms of talent. But he spoke of how the older generation, and in fact, Ebony Rainford Brent also expressed the same sentiment, how the older generation, because of the racism that they'd experienced and because of the exclusion they'd experienced from the system, as it were very reluctant to allow them to cross the divide from the community club into the unknown and potentially racist structures of county cricket. I don't think it's too over the top to sort of just say that racism was really quite pervasive through the 80s and 90s in Britain, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's still been a problem in recent generations. But that was their experience, that they were caught between two things. They were looking, for example, literally across the fence, the chain link fence from one club into, let's say, North Middlesex, with all the resources, fantastic wickets, multiple training sessions, lots of coaches, and thinking, I want some of that. I want to be on that side. With the older generation saying, stay with us. The struggle is more important than your ambition. So that's something which kind of falls on the community in really complex ways, which I don't want to be at all judgmental about. Then there's the closure of cricket spaces, cricket grounds, cricket facilities across urban England, which happens from the 70s onwards, which I think disproportionately affects inner city Black West Indian communities. And whilst cricket's still thriving in rural areas in England during that period of time, a lot of cricket grounds are being shut. And those are two factors. The demise of the West Indies cricket team, I think, is a complex factor in all of this. I mean, on the one hand, it's undeniable that the success of West Indian elite cricketers was a great kind of spur to the development of young cricketers in England, Black cricketers in England. But on the other hand, a whole generation of Black West Indians and their children become elite footballers. And they do not do that because any team from the Caribbean is internationally successful. So there are many ways in which a kind of local, indigenous system of Black sport can grow up and succeed without that kind of influence from the Caribbean. So I think we have to be a bit careful about that argument that once the West Indies, sort of go into decline, then so automatically must Black cricket in England go into decline. It's certainly something that Ebony Rainford Brent, in her efforts to revive the game, is very resistant to. And she makes a big point of saying that she did not get into cricket as a young girl in Brixton because of the West Indies cricket team. She said she loved football, she loved John Barnes and Liverpool. That was her thing. She started playing cricket, and I think this is really important because cricket is a wonderful game. It is fun. And that's why she started playing. And I think that should give us hope, to speak to your point about, renewal. But of course, we're fighting against football and the money that there is in football. And that will always be now a much, much bigger draw, I think, for young Black kids, Black English kids. It's obviously much more exciting to look to football, the riches, the stardom, and the constant kind of coverage on television, etc.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael, for a fascinating talk. Just to let you know that I had a bit of experience of witnessing the way in which West Indian immigrants were treated, because at the age of 16, I joined Barclays Bank in 1961 at Notting Hill branch. And it wasn't racism, but it was the system that distinguished the customers, because the white customers had current accounts, checkbook accounts, and those were mechanized so they could walk into a branch, cash a check, and walk out again. And the check was dealt with later on at back office. Whereas the deposit account customers, which the West Indians had to be because they couldn't get a checkbook account because they didn't know somebody who had a checkbook account for 3 years to introduce them to us. So they had a deposit account, and deposit accounts were handwritten. And the best time for them to come in was on a Saturday morning between 9:30 and 12:30. And there was one deposit account counter, generally speaking, and four other counters. A queue out of the door of West Indian customers with their passbooks waiting to be dealt with by me, having to write up their books and compare ledgers. And the white customers with their checkbooks would walk into any one of four cashiers and walk out 2 seconds later. I found it very embarrassing. On occasions, some of the other cashiers would deal with the West Indian deposit account customers, but it wasn't fair. Now, just continue a little bit on this, because 1963, I'd worked several Saturday mornings in a row, and the Lord's Test match was on the Monday, getting very exciting. I said to the chief clerk, "Can I go have my afternoon off this afternoon and go watch the Test match?" So off I went and got to the ground. England were 33 for 3, chasing whatever they were chasing. Colin Cowdrey came out to bat, and a terrible crack happened when you could hear it throughout the ground when his wrist was broken. And I can understand one of the West Indians who was sitting next to me saying, I won't use the accent because I can't do the accent, "Go on, kill him, man." Where he was brought some of his fellow West Indians thought that was a bit much, and just for him to calm down. But I could understand his frustration at the way that West Indian people were treated in this country at that time. That's what I had to say. Thank you very much.
John Reed next. You've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. First of all, to Michael, thank you for an excellent presentation, really interesting. And I would like to absolutely applaud and endorse your point with respect to the importance of sport and cricket in particular in understanding imperial and colonial history. My own study is on the history of cricket in Eastern Canada, and in particularly in Halifax, but also in the city of Sydney, in Cape Breton Island. There was substantial Caribbean migration, immigration in the early 20th century, and clubs that primarily were functioning in the 1900s, 1910s, and 1920s. Now, the major club in Halifax, the Halifax West Indians, was undoubtedly a club of permanent immigrants, but it also had a kind of rolling complement of people who were crew members on the mail ships from the Caribbean and to some extent from Royal Naval vessels who not only played for the team on occasion, but also took the cricket club as a kind of social hub when they were in Halifax Harbour. So I was wondering, totally different time period, of course, and different context, but I was wondering if there's any kind of equivalent to that, perhaps in places like Bristol and Liverpool, where you would get crew members from vessels who are participating with the club in the city, or whether that's just a phenomenon that doesn't take place in the UK at that time.
Thank you so much, John, for that question. I mean, I haven't got any specific evidence that can sort of prove such occurrences. But more generally, the arrival of immigrants from the Caribbean, and indeed, of course, from India and the Indian subcontinent and other parts of Africa as well. But in a cricket context, first and foremost, the Caribbean and then secondly, India, often arrive in port cities for obvious reasons, because they would travel by ship. So, Bristol, Cardiff, Liverpool, those are, Southampton to a slightly lesser extent. And there's a particular reason for that, which is that Southampton, you typically take the boat train into Waterloo, and Waterloo becomes, that area of Waterloo becomes an absolute hub for West Indian immigrants. And likewise, Paddington Station, and not the Notting Hill or Nottingdale area in particular around it, becomes an important hub. So I don't have any sort of specific information on that, but you can definitely see, and it's particularly true in Liverpool and the surrounding areas, that a lot of immigrants who are coming off the boats or who are working on boats play kind of significant role in the sporting ecosystem and the cricket ecosystem. But by the way, many of these cricket clubs, and this speaks to a bygone age where cricket and football were really kind of two sides of the same coin. Many of these cricket clubs, these Caribbean clubs, also fielded football teams during the winter season. So cricketers and footballers were far more common as a combined kind of skill and expertise. I suppose Dennis Compton was the most famous and probably the best exponent of that art, because he played for Arsenal and England at football, and England, I can't remember his county. I'm sure somebody here will be able to tell me.
Middlesex.
Middlesex, yeah, okay. I thought so. So that's extraordinary. So yes, so many of them were playing both football and cricket as part of the what was often called a Caribbean sports and social club. But thank you. I'm sorry I don't have more kind of precise information on that, but it's definitely a very interesting area to look at.
If I may, a couple of observations, really, Michael. I was very interested in your picture of the Peak Friends factory team, and I live very near where that organization's factory was, so there's still plenty of memories of it in the Bermondsey area, not least a very nice mural under the arches.
The museum as well, I think.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and one of the things that a lot of the works teams did was, including Peak Friends, was that they actually moved their grounds from the area that they operated into the suburbs. So I think their ground finished up being in somewhere like Beckenham or Bromley or Beckenham. That's part of London, because Millwall Football Club also used to train there. And I think there was a general migration, and certainly the Banks were the same. They created these wonderful grounds in the suburbs, which would have been great places to play, but it sort of goes contrary to what you were saying, in that a lot of the Windrush migrants lived far more centrally, and therefore it was more inconvenient to get to Bromley or Beckenham. I think with Ebony Rainford Brent's ACE program, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, I played in a game against them last year, and it was within our team, someone who Simon Lister, has written 3 very interesting books about West Indies cricket: Fire in Babylon, the book about Clive Lloyd, and then more recently about Frank Worrell. And we all had a conversation at the end about the identity, and virtually all the members of the ACE program, whether they'd been brought up in the UK or not, had an interest in West Indian identity. It was slightly skewed by the numbers 1, 2, and 3 for ACE program were over from the West Indies, trying to get contracts and they were by far their best players, incidentally. But anyway, it was a fascinating discussion, and here they are, sort of 4 or 5 generations in from when their grandparents or great grandparents arrived, and they still finding it difficult to say I'm British or whether I'm West Indian or not.
That is very, very interesting. I mean, I think I have a slightly, possibly slightly unorthodox view on this, and particularly for a historian, or maybe not. But I'm saying that the heritage argument is insufficient to drive the success of cricket in contemporary Britain. I mean, I'm sure you will find a few boys and girls, you know, for whom it's incredibly meaningful, and they will talk about their grandparents' love of cricket, and you know, they will know a lot about the game and its history. But what I'm arguing, and here I'm just really drawing on James, is that real cricket in its kind of truly great form is the product of a historical moment in which it is lived and breathed, and it becomes incredibly meaningful. So that sort of rise of West Indian identity in the 50s, 60s, and the whole sort of anti-colonial spirit, even the kind of embrace of Rastafarianism by Viv Richards, and although you know these are sort of forms of motivation to play and engage in cricket, which go very far beyond just the enjoyment of the game in and of itself. Likewise, I mean, cricket, the rise of cricket in India, which, by the way, a bit of an elephant in the room, you know, not mentioning India at all, but as many of you will know, comes very much later in the subcontinent. The adoption of cricket as a popular national sport is a much later phenomenon in India than it is in the Caribbean. The deep historical roots of cricket in the Caribbean are 200 or plus years old. In India, in the 1940s, people are still arguing eloquently about cricket as a kind of colonial imposition, as a game which exacerbates communal tensions, because a lot of cricket was played around religious organizations. You know, there was the Hindu Gymkhana, the Muslim Gymkhana, and so on, the Parsi Gymkhana. So Gandhi argued very eloquently that cricket was a divisive force in India, not a national force. And it was a kind of game played by social elites most of the time in relatively small parts of the country. It's not until India almost accidentally won the World Cup in 1983 that it sort of really starts to take off. But my point really is that today cricket is absolutely sort of integral to the expression of India's global rise, to its nationalist moment in world history. And so what I think we need to do in England in order to, first and foremost, enable people to enjoy this fantastic game that, you know, we love so much, but also to kind of drive participation and excellence, is find ways to encourage, in this case, you know, black children who might claim some kind of Caribbean heritage to play the game without relying on tales of Clive Lloyd and Viv Richards, because I personally do not believe that is a sufficient motivating factor. I think you have to make the game vibrant and real in the present, and that's where we come back to the challenge of cricket versus football, which doesn't make me especially optimistic. But I know that there's always a lot of, you know, I think that the language and the analysis of West Indian cricket decline or black cricket decline is always framed in terms of the decline of the West Indies team. And I think it's an analytical error. I think what was much more significant in terms of the decline of Caribbean cricket in England was what was really going on at the social level in England itself. And here I would come back to the Haringey Cricket Club and its closure in 1996-7. The really kind of ruthless indifference of the Test and County Cricket Board, and then Lord Maclaurin's newly formed ECB towards the Haringey project, which sent an absolute shockwave across the black cricket community in England. I've written elsewhere about this if anybody's interested, and there is some of it in the book, but I've written separately about it in academic journals. And the fact of the matter is that the Haringey Cricket College fell apart and went under for want of around £10,000 in 1996-7, even though there was probably new lottery money coming on stream within about 6 months. and I assembled quite a lot of evidence to show that the ECB board was fully cognizant of what was going on. They were fully aware of how successful the Haringey project had been, and yet they just turned their back on it and said it was clearly not important in terms of the future of English cricket. And that was a very, very big wound to the black cricket community. So I think if we keep focusing on the West Indies cricket team and the heritage argument, we lose sight of these things which are going on actually within the structures of our own game, which I think are not the full explanation, but they are important factors in all of this.
And I think the ACE program is making good progress.
Yes.
And in addition to that, the ECB are very firmly behind it in proper financial terms.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. But of course, what's happening now is that there is a sort of argument going on within the ACE program and associated groups around whether or not the ACE program is really a project to resurrect Caribbean cricket heritage, or whether it's more of a sort of inner city cricket project. So quite a lot of people from the older generations within the Caribbean community complain that it's not. It's called the African Caribbean Engagement Program, but that's not what it's really about. And what they're saying is, for example, there are a lot of Afghan boys and girls who are part of ACE. And that's correct. That's true. Because what ACE really is about giving cricket talent pathway opportunities to talented cricketers from inner city environments. When Haringey was doing that in the 80s, they were almost all from Black Caribbean backgrounds. But now the population is more diverse, and many of them are actually from South Asian backgrounds. But they're not turning them away, because in a sense that would be a kind of form of racial exclusion. So in actual fact, the ACE program really should also be helping any child of any color, even if they were white working class kids coming forward. So it's complicated, Peter. It's complicated, but it is absolutely doing a great job.
Yes, and they're well represented in different cities as well, which I think is the important thing. It's not just a London-centric organisation.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think we've used up a lot of your time already, an hour and a half, Michael. I think unless anyone has any other questions, I think we could probably ask you all sorts of things. It was a fascinating talk, and thank you very much indeed for doing that. I think there's lots more you can probably unearth on the subject, isn't there? And I'm sure that you'll hopefully get the support and encouragement to do that. I know I've talked to you about the cricketers that sort of bucked the system in the county game in the 60s, people like Danny Livingstone and Carlton Forbes. Just as a small aside, I met Mike Selvey recently, and he started playing for Surrey at the same time Dennis Marriott became the first Windrush cricketer to play for Surrey. And some of these people have passed away, but there are one or two still alive, and someone like Mike Selvey, I'm sure, will give you a very good insight into what it was like for Dennis Marriott. But there's so much in this subject, isn't it? But I think you've given us a really intriguing insight tonight, and I think
thank you so much.
We're very grateful for your time. So I think
we appreciate it.
We'll give you a kind of metaphorical clap if that's all right.
Okay.
And what Rodney does now is he uses puts it online for the other members, if that's okay.
That's absolutely fine.
He uses a rather impressive software called Filmora, which will obliterate everything that I've said and focus entirely on you, which is important. But thanks for your support.
Thank you so much, everyone.
ACS.
I really appreciate you coming along, and I look forward to maybe meeting some of you possibly at a Cricket Society event, or who knows, around the boundary edge somewhere.
We've got an ACS day on the 7th of July at the Civil Service Club, where you've obviously been. So, and then we'll have an online members meeting in October as well. So hopefully we can get you involved in some of that.
I'll try to come along. Thank you so much.
All right. All the best. Have a nice evening,
All
everyone.
the best. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Good night.
you.